Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and this is part two of the American West recorded lecture. And so in the first part, just to recap, we covered talking about the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad, also the cattle industry, and how it kind of went, was a booming time and then ended up busting in 1885, 1886 winter as prices plummeted and so forth. So in this part, I'm gonna be covering kind of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was tremendously famous, as well as what was life like for homesteaders and so forth, as well as farmers' unions. And then we'll get to the conflicts with Native Americans and also minorities and immigration and so forth in the American West in part three. So I want to emphasize the importance of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It was tremendously popular in the United States, but also tremendously popular in the European countries as it toured in Europe as well. It was tremendously popular, made a lot of money. This really helps personify in American culture this idea and glorification of the Wild West and the American West and so forth. And Buffalo Bill Cody, who had been a kind of a hunter and fur trapper and so forth, really played on this fictional legend beautifully. And so he really was one of the most famous people, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And one of the things reason why his Wild West show was so popular is these pieces of literature that were called dime novels. Hence, they were cost a dime. They were short stories and they were fictional, but they were based on like real life individuals. And it kind of made them like legendary figures in American history, like Davy Crockett, George Armstrong Custer and so forth. And in fact, in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, they would reenact Custer's last stand. And he actually hired real Native Americans to portray in these shootouts, and they'd have Native Americans attacking stagecoaches and cowboys, and they would have people that could do horse riding tricks and shooting tricks and so forth. He even used sharpshooter little Annie Oakley and her husband, who did tricks with firearms and shooting and so forth. In fact, little Annie Oakley even shot something off the head of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, the guy who was the leader of Germany during World War I. And during World War I, she later said she wished she had missed. Buffalo Bill Cody even hired the Sioux chief Sitting Bull in one of his seasons to tour with him and so forth. And so began in 1883, but really became tremendously popular in the U.S. and Europe, and people paid as much money as they could afford to see it, and it was extremely popular. This is an advertisement of acting out a stagecoach getting attacked by Indians and so forth, and cattle ranching and Custer's Last Stand and all this other stuff. Here's Buffalo Bill Cody taking a picture with Sitting Bull. And Calamity Jane on the left, famous female Western character, as well as Annie Oakley on the right. Now let's talk about what life was like for the homesteaders. So there's two things that led to people going out west, and that's the availability of railroad land, and the railroads did a beautiful job of advertising this land, as well as the Homestead Act. So about 500,000 took advantage of the Homestead Act. And so let me kind of explain what the Homestead Act consists of. So you had to be 21 years of age to take advantage of the Homestead Act. The only cost you had to pay, because it was basically free, is you had to pay a $5 to $10 administration fee. And what that was is basically you're paying for your land deed. Doesn't matter if your parents gave you the land, you'd have to pay a $5 to $10 administration fee for the land. That's just part of it. So with the exception of that, it was free. You had to cultivate the land for 5 years, and you had to live there 6 months out of the year, and the land was yours. Okay. The railroads aggressively advertised and offered cut rate tickets and sold off their land at bargain prices. Advertisements even appeared in Europe and in many different languages to attract immigrants. Many settlers experienced early success thanks to increased rainfall between 1878 and 1886. Since there were very little timber on the plains, settlers built their homes out of sod, which is grass and dirt, and had to bust up the tough grasses in the plains to farm thanks to the steel plow. This is where they got the nickname sodbusters. Now, the federal government does this because they want to settle the Great Plains states. And you can see in the population changes from this graph on the left how much the land in the western states shoots up in comparison to what it had previously, and so forth. Here's an example of a homesteader or sodbuster family with their Conestoga wagon. This one really illustrates, I think, well, what a typical sod busting family home will look like. It was usually one room and made out of dirt and grass. I'm 6'4", and these homes are discriminatory against tall people. I wouldn't be able to stand up straight in this home. And this home reminds me of a really a fascinating story that I tell my students every year. It's not going to be on a quiz or a test, but I think it's helps you kind of understand the toughness of some of these settlers that went out west. And so I attended a teacher training when I was years ago. I got approved for this grant to attend a training at the University of Colorado at Boulder, taught by this guy named Elliot West on the American West. And interesting, his last name is West. He was actually one of my professors at the University of Arkansas in graduate school, and one of the best teachers I ever had. He's probably the best storyteller of all time. Won a bunch of national teaching awards, but we had to read about 4 books before we attended this teacher training, and got a ton of professional development hours. But one of the books he had us read was this fascinating story about this woman named Rachel Kaloff. Now, Rachel was actually a Russian Jew, only spoke Yiddish, and her birth mother had died, and her father had remarried her stepmother, and her stepmother didn't like the fact that her new husband had previous children with the previous marriage. And so they went off and lived with a relative. And she was about 18 and hadn't found a husband yet, and had got notification at the Jewish synagogue. There was a picture of a young man sent from the United States. It was a Russian Jewish family that had come and began settling in the Dakotas, and particularly North Dakota, and was looking for a Russian female bride. And so they sent his family, her relatives did, her picture, and he decided that, hey, Rachel was an attractive woman. He was a good-looking guy. They wanted to get married. So at the age of 18, she traveled by train to Germany. Okay. Now, speaking of which, she didn't speak any German, and then had trouble, barely made it to her train because of different immigration papers for the time, which were very primitive. Got on a ship, sailed across the Atlantic by herself, never had left her homeland in her life, traveled to New York city bustling, had, other than a picture, has really nothing, doesn't know a thing about this guy other than he's a Russian Jew. And he ends up, had been waiting there for a couple months for her to arrive, eventually encounters her at some point in the docks or at a local synagogue. I can't remember, it's been so long since I read the book. And they traveled together out into North Dakota. Now, before they traveled, he was a very nice guy, a gentleman, and said, look, after meeting me, if you don't want to marry me, I understand. I'll pay for your passage back. And she said, no, I still want to marry you. So they travel out to North Dakota, and there's been 3 sodbuster homes built for them, and one for him and her once they're married, because they waited about a month or 2 before they got married. And so she had to live with she was soon to be in-laws, which was pretty awkward because her mother-in-law was an interesting character. And also his brother and his wife and so forth had another sod busting house. And man, she's this witty, feisty, tough as nails woman. And the story is just fascinating, what all she endured. I mean, after giving birth to her first child, she got a fever and was like hallucinating, and still got up and cleaned the house. Because fuel was so expensive, particularly wood and buffalo dung. Every winter for several years, she and her husband, as well as her brother-in-law and his wife, had to live with their children in a 1-bedroom house like that every winter. And you know how long the winters are in North Dakota. Can you imagine? And her mother-in-law would get into it frequently, which is kind of a humorous part of the book. And, she was feisty and let her have it and so forth. But she talked about years later, when she was recounting her story for her youngest son, how it really made her and her husband's marriage really strong. And she remembers that, even though it was great difficulty, some of the best years of their marriage, and it brought them closer together and so forth. They ended up moving to Minnesota, and got in, as her husband ended up getting in and becoming starting schools and becoming a superintendent and so forth, and they gave up farming. But it's a fascinating story of really, kind of that immigrant American resiliency and toughness and ambition and risk takers. I mean, the fact that she gets on a boat from Russia, well, after traveling to Germany, and goes to meet this guy she had never met before that's going to be her husband, and they were, all accounts, pretty happily married throughout their life, at least according to her youngest son's account. Although their marriage, I think, was a little more strained later years, but still, it's an incredible story in American history. And so that's what you have to understand so much about American history, is it's full of personal stories. This house right here was one of the prefabricated houses that you could purchase. So this one was obviously more expensive. This is a family who had done better financially farming on the Great Plains, but because timber was in short supply, you could, through a mail order catalog such as Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward, you could order a prefabricated house. It would be cut and pre-assembled in the upper Midwestern states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Michigan, and then shipped by rail to wherever you would request it in the Great Plains states. And it would arrive there within 2 weeks. Now, that is incredible. That is part of the market revolution taking place in the late 1800s. Now, this is a typo. I think it says there was about 6,000 exodusters that came to Kansas. I think in the previous lecture I had it was a typo and said 60,000. About 6,000 African Americans had come to escape sharecropping in the South. And so by the 1880, U.S. Census showed about 40,000 blacks living in Kansas. And people had to gather buffalo and cattle droppings for fuel for their fires. Prescribed gender roles broke down as women shouldered men's work on new farms and became self-reliant in the face of danger and hardship. When their spouse died, women operated farms on their own, and women helped bring in money by selling eggs or butter, which oftentimes gave the family cushion when crops failed. Many immigrants came to the Great Plains, especially in northern plains, from countries like Norway, Sweden, and Russia. Colorado was brought to the Union in 1876, while North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming were brought to the Union between 1889 and 1890 to bring more Republican votes. And so you have new Western states brought in the Union pretty quickly. And so let's talk about the difficulty of life on the Great Plains. Settlers found the landscape pretty challenging because from 1876 to 1885, 1886, you had a period of rainfall surplus. And so, but then after that, you had time periods where it was big drought. Between 1885 and 1890, about 50,000 settlers left North and South Dakota. And one of the reasons why Minneapolis and St. Paul took off is because settlers who went bust on North and South Dakota came there. You oftentimes had hardships from insects, such as grasshoppers who could wipe out a crop in a day, or locusts. Brush fires caused by lightning or hailstorms often wipe out crops in an hour. And most farmers mostly planted hard kernel wheat from Russia that could withstand extreme temperatures, which was smart on their part. Dry farming techniques consisted of deep planting to bring subsoil moisture to the roots and quick harrowing after rainfalls to turn over dry mulch that slowed evaporation. Now, let me explain what dry farming technique was. Dry farming is a short-term gain for a long-term problem. So what they did is, since there's not as much rain on the Great Plains, it's a land of semi-aridity. When they would get a heavy rain, they would go and dig down and then bring up dry soil and then compact it on top of the wet soil to compact it and keep the moisture from evaporating. Now, several years doing that, it's not that big of a deal. But if you do it year after year, decade after decade, eventually you're going to till up the soil too much. And then what happens is, if you have some dry seasons, that soil is going to be so tilled up, it's going to be like sand. And that's exactly what happens in the Dust Bowl in the 1830s on the Great Plains states. And we'll get to that when we get to a later module in this course. And so by the turn of the century, about half of the nation's cattle and sheep, a third of its cereal crops, and nearly 3/5 of its wheat came from the newly settled lands. So short-term gain was great. We're going to pay a long-term consequence for this, the dry farming techniques. So the Great Plains were really, almost in some ways, kind of came close to doubling. Okay, not quite, but the United States agricultural and livestock capacity. And so as for those who've taken me U.S. History 1, the United States becomes an agricultural and industrial powerhouse, and because we cultivated so much more land. Now, the grasses were so thick on the Great Plains, you had to have John Deere's steel plow, or just steel plow in general, but he's the one that invented it, to dig up and plow up those thick grasslands. And so it was a very difficult process. And farming on the Great Plains is very expensive. So eventually what you're going to have is farmers are going to start pulling their resources together, and eventually you're going to develop what's called corporate farming. And so farming done by corporations. It started out by just communal farmers that would do it, and then eventually expanded to farming corporations. And we see that today on the Great Plains states as well. Now, one of the things that you'll see is as farmers rushed to buy more land and purchase better farm equipment, they were quick to borrow money from banks. Well, that you can pay back your debt when you have good years, but when you have bad years, you can go bust. And most of the time, farmers were at a disadvantage in dealing with big business that supplied them with machinery and transportation. Okay, this is a steel plow plowing up the grasslands. Okay, this is a grain reaper, or what was called a mechanized reaper later. You can see how many horses it takes to pull it. My word. So you can see why corporate farming developed. Think how much expensive it would be to have that many horses. A small scale farmer can't compete with that. Here's a little bit of a small scale farming with the typical grain reaper. Here are kind of like windmills that could generate as a water pump. Okay. And it pumps up groundwater for irrigation. Talked about dry farming. And dry farming was successful at first, but it's going to be a long-term problem. And so one of the things you could have is you could have tornadoes that come across these Great Plains states. They call it Tornado Alley for a reason, at least part of it, and so forth. Oftentimes, though, railroads would hurt them on prices, or if they complained, they would put their crops in wet warehouses so their crops would rot. Farms slowly developed from family-run operations with horse or ox-drawn machines to more mechanized, large-scale farming operations. A powerful steam engine could drag behind it simultaneously the plow, seeder, and harrow. The speed of harvesting wheat was dramatically increased in the 1870s by the invention of the twine binder, and then in 1880s by the combine. So we see big tractor combines today. It was drawn by 20 to 40 horses, and both reaped and bagged the grain. As more and more small farmers failed, they moved to the cities, leaving room for large-scale farming. Wheat farming in Minnesota and North Dakota had our farms about 15,000 acres that are corporately farmed. They had to use a telephone to communicate. Farmers have always been individualistic by nature and have difficulty organizing. So we're going to talk about farm unions, and it's going to help lead to the populist movement that we'll cover in the Gildade's Politics recorded lecture. Here's a twine binder up on the top left. Here's what a big tractor combine today. Suckers cost like $250,000, $300,000. Suckers are ridiculously expensive now. Cost more than my house, I'll tell you that. Now, let's talk about the first farmers' labor union. In 1867, Oliver H. Kelly founded the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry to help farmers out. At first, the Grange consisted of dances, picnics, and lectures, but quickly turned in cooperative programs. These programs consisted of purchasing in bulk from suppliers and setting up its own banks, insurance companies, grain elevators, and in Iowa, even a manufacturing plant for farm implements. So let me kind of explain this. Okay. So farmers coming together to purchase things in bulk. It's kind of like Sam's and Costco. If you buy things in bulk, you can get cheaper prices. Okay. Also, you have farmers' credit unions that are established. We still see farmers' credit unions throughout rural America for farming areas. I see it as I travel to schools and so forth for my job. I've also seen insurance companies that were started by farmers, grain elevators. So like these are where you would pay to store your grain in a silo, or you would have to pay for the grain elevator rates and so forth. They could pull their money together and purchase those, so that way they can get fairer prices. And in Iowa, they even created this manufacturing plant for farm implements. So I'll give you an example. When electricity started coming about to rural America, my wife and I, we lived in Murphy, Texas for about 3.5 years. And the electric company that was in our area was a cooperative, and it was called Farmers Electric Cooperative. And it was done decades before by farmers to purchase electricity so to keep them from being what they felt like would be exploited. They would pull their resources together, and farmers kind of started an electric cooperative, so to speak. And so anyway, but it some places are deregulated in Texas, and other places are regulated. This particular area was regulated. Now, most of some of these farmers cooperatives fails, but Montgomery Ward, the great mail order catalog, formed to serve the Grange in 1872. Now, Montgomery Ward is no longer around, but for a long time it was one of the most famous department stores and had a famous mail order catalog. In local elections, the Grange ran on anti-monopoly platforms and even were successful in enacting Granger laws, such as regulating grain elevators, fixing maximum railroad rates so that a railroad couldn't charge you above a certain amount, and prohibiting discriminatory treatment of small and short haul shippers. So one of the things that they would do for railroad companies at this time. So if you were shipping your goods from, say, Nebraska to California, okay, they would give you a cheaper rate, okay, because it was more expensive typically to ship that way. But how they would make up on their profit loss was shorter routes, let's say Omaha to Chicago, which was made all the time and it had a big demand of it. They would charge much higher rates on that. So if you were a farmer who had to ship a short haul, you got price exploited compared to a person who shipped it much further, and so forth. So sometimes you'll see, like with airlines, if it's a less desired route, they will be more expensive. But if it's more frequent route, that'll be cheaper. But sometimes they'll make it where it's the opposite of that, and so forth. And so farmers felt like that they were getting exploited at this time because of that. Eventually, the Grange transitioned into the Farmers Alliance. So the Grange was these farmers union at the local level. The Farmers Alliance is at the state level. And eventually, the Farmers Alliance, after it formed in Texas, began to expand to the national level, and that became known as the People's Party, and it was popularly called the Populist. And so, one of the things, though, that the Farmers Alliance failed at is it failed to include tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and blacks. And so there was even a black Farmers Alliance that formed in the South as well. And so the Populist Party, or People's Party, was a national political party and one of the most successful third parties in American history. Now, they lose when they kind of support William Jennings Bryan, who was a Democrat, kind of a Democrat populist, in the election of 1896 and 1900. But they do get people elected to Congress from the Populist Party. Now, we're going to cover the fate of Native Americans and also talking about the minorities and immigrants and so forth in the third part lecture.